He opened the envelope expecting a birthday card. It was a court order. His mother was forcing the sale of the house he thought was his. The nursery, legally reclassified. The basement she was banished to, evidence in a breach case. "You made me sleep beneath your future," she told her son. "Now I own the right to end it." And upstairs, Mira asked, "Can she do that?" But Margaret already had. "All right. Before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from." The first thing Margaret noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the unsettling quiet that replaces something that once belonged. The hallway light was still on upstairs, but the guest room door stood ajar, casting a long sliver of light over the hardwood floor. She stepped forward slowly, the afternoon sun behind her shadowing the hallway. The room was empty, her bookshelves gone, the framed photo of her and Harold, her late husband, replaced by a shelf of pastel toys. And against the far wall, beneath the window she used to open each morning for fresh air, sat a white crib with satin bows on the railings. She didn't speak at first. Her hand rested lightly on the door frame as if her balance might betray her. Mira's voice came floating in from behind. "Oh, you're home early," Mira said brightly, walking in with a shopping bag full of baby bottles and folded onesies. "Alan thought you'd be out till 5. Surprise!" Margaret turned slowly. Her son wasn't far behind, carrying a new diaper pail still in its box. His eyes flicked up at her and then away. "We were just thinking ahead," Mira said, her voice saccharine. "With the baby coming so soon, we wanted to make the most of the space. You'll be more comfortable downstairs anyway. It's temporary." "Basement's warmer than it used to be," Alan added weakly, trying to sound helpful. "And the stairs are good for your legs. Doctor said movement helps, right?" Margaret's mouth curved into something like a smile, but her eyes didn't follow. "Of course," she said softly. "Circulation." No one asked how she felt. No one mentioned her books, her sewing machine, the photos. She wasn't sure if they were packed away or tossed. Later that evening, Margaret stood in the basement, holding her breath in the heavy air. The single cot Mira had mentioned was wedged between the water heater and a metal rack full of boxes. No windows, no closet. One bare bulb flickering overhead like a pulse losing rhythm. The floor was concrete, still cold despite the rug they'd laid out to soften the blow. A folding table with a plastic chair sat in one corner, as if she'd requested an office. A floral pillow, her pillow, had been tossed at the end of the cot. The kind gesture of someone rearranging the pieces of a puzzle they didn't understand. Margaret sat slowly. The cot squeaked beneath her weight, the springs groaning as if in protest. She let her hand trail along the chipped wall behind her, the cinder blocks coarse under her fingers. Paint peeled where moisture had seeped through the years. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she reached beneath the cot where her luggage sat half unzipped. From the side pouch, she pulled out a fire-safe lockbox. Its surface was scratched, but the lock still clicked open with the same 4 numbers she and Harold had always used, the year they bought their first home together, 1978. Inside were the papers no one had asked her about, the original deed to the house. Not a copy, not a scan, but the ink-stamped, county-filed original with both names typed clearly across the top. Hers first, then Alan's. It had been a compromise back then, her pension, her savings, half of Harold's insurance money folded into the down payment. Alan was just starting out. Mira hadn't even been in the picture. Margaret traced the edges of the paper. She could still remember the smell of the notary's office, the cheap coffee, the way her hands had trembled, not with doubt, but with pride. She was building something permanent. Now? She looked up at the ceiling, at the pipes that snaked across it like vines trying to reclaim the house from the inside out. Somewhere above her, Mira's laugh echoed through the floorboards. Alan said something in return. Then quiet again. She folded the deed back carefully, locked the box, and slid it beneath the cot. If they wanted to forget what she built, that was their choice. But she hadn't. That night, as the baby mobile clicked into slow motion above the crib in her old room, Margaret sat upright under the humming bulb of the basement, her hand on the lockbox, and in the quiet, she whispered, "It's still mine." The sound of heavy footsteps woke Margaret before the light did. She sat up in the basement cot, still half draped in the blanket she'd pulled over herself during the cold night. Upstairs, the thud of something being dragged echoed through the floorboards, followed by a man's voice, casual, unfamiliar. She didn't rush. She had learned not to. By the time she made it to the top of the stairs, the guest room, the one that used to be hers, was wide open. A man in a paint-splattered hoodie was shouldering her antique dresser through the front door. Mira stood nearby, watching him with a latte in one hand and her phone in the other. "What's happening?" Margaret asked, her voice low but firm. Mira didn't flinch. "Oh, that? I sold it. Marketplace pickup. We needed to clear space for the changing station. You weren't using it." Margaret's mouth opened, but she said nothing. The man gave a half nod as he passed, then disappeared down the front steps with the dresser, its mirror wobbling in the straps. Margaret stepped into the room, the scent of lemon cleaner still lingering. On the floor, beside a new hamper filled with tiny onesies, sat a bin. One of those clear plastic ones you buy in bulk. Inside, her things. Books, scarves, a framed photo of her and Harold in matching windbreakers, their smiles wide and real. On the lid, a strip of blue tape with one word, "Donate." She bent slowly, her knees stiff, and ran her fingers over the tape. Mira was back on her phone. "If you want anything, feel free to grab it now. I'm dropping that bin off tomorrow." Margaret's fingers tightened around the photo frame, her thumb pressing into the glass. Then she straightened, turned, and left the room in silence. But her chest was louder than ever. Downstairs again, she pulled her old laptop from the suitcase tucked beneath the cot. It took a moment to boot, the fan humming louder than she remembered. The screen flickered to life. She clicked through folders, past vacation pictures and tax spreadsheets, until she found what she needed, a PDF labeled Deed and Co-Agreement, Final Signed. She opened it, scrolled again. There it was. Co-occupancy terms. All structural changes, room reassignments, or significant household shifts require consent from both named owners. Residency and equity shall remain active and protected until co-ownership is dissolved in writing or via legal means. Her name, Allen's. Hers listed first. The memory was vivid now. The first check she'd written after Harold's funeral, the ache of it, the terror, and the hope. "At least my name will still mean something," she'd said to herself, her pen trembling as she filled out the amount. She saved a fresh copy of the PDF and uploaded it to the cloud, backed it up again on a flash drive. This wasn't paranoia. This was preparation. That weekend, Mira hosted a small brunch for her girlfriends. From the basement, Margaret could hear them laughing, muffled but distinct. "She's been a huge help," Mira was saying to someone, "but it's nice to finally have our space upstairs. The nursery's coming together so beautifully." Our space. The word struck like a nail through velvet. Margaret stayed in the basement. She didn't walk up, didn't knock, just sat on the edge of the cot and looked at her hands. Steady, capable hands that had once folded every fitted sheet in this house, scrubbed every tile after dinner, helped them move in. Later that night, as Mira slept and Alan snored faintly 2 floors above, Margaret moved quietly through the basement. She took out her phone, opened the camera, started documenting everything. The concrete floor with its cracks like spider webs, the single bulb casting shadows, the vent overhead, blowing weak air, her cot, the water heater, the chipped wall. Each photo time-stamped, each one uploaded immediately to a secure folder in the cloud. She labeled the album Residency Conditions, Margaret Doyle. And then she took one last picture of the door to the basement itself. The hinges had been removed, it no longer closed. The sound of helium balloons brushing the ceiling woke Margaret before the music started. She sat up in the cot, the quilt slipping from her shoulders. A wave of laughter floated down through the old air vent in the corner, muffled but clear enough to identify voices not her own. Women's voices. Chatter, clinking glasses, the creak of a new stroller being wheeled across the wood floor. She hadn't been told what time the baby shower would start, only that it was happening today and that she'd probably want to keep a low profile. Mira's words texted that morning. "No, please. No, thank you. Just instructions. Margaret made herself tea with a dented electric kettle, the same one she'd used when Alan was still in high school, and she'd wait up for him to come home from night shifts at the gas station. Now, she stirred the tea bag slowly. Saturday waited. The basement had no windows, just a grate letting in the smell of someone's heavily scented plug-in upstairs. Sweet vanilla? Too strong. At one point, through the vent, she heard someone compliment the hardwood floors. Another voice gushed over the nursery wallpaper. Mira's voice chimed in, cheerful and bright. "We're so lucky. Alan worked so hard for this house." There was a pause in Margaret's chest, a small stinging high, itch, and then a slow exhale. She reached for her phone, hit record. The vent trembled slightly from someone walking overhead. Margaret sat back and listened to the compliments, the soft shuffle of wrapping paper, the distant pop of sparkling cider. Through all of it, she sat still, like a ghost beneath a stage. Later, after the noise faded and she heard the last guest leave, Margaret opened the lid of the cedar chest at the foot of her cot. Inside was a bundle of envelopes, carefully stacked and bound with a worn piece of twine. She pulled one free, the edges yellowed, the ink still clear. Harold's handwriting. She unfolded the paper, slow and reverent. "Margie, if anything ever happens to me, don't let them turn your help into their history. You built this. Don't let them forget that." Her throat tightened. It was always him who reminded her she mattered, even now. By evening, Margaret was back at her laptop. She opened a folder titled Ownership and Contributions. The folder was mostly empty, but not for long. She pulled out the accordion binder she'd tucked into her suitcase the night Mira told her the nursery would be taking her room. She scanned in her canceled checks from 10 years ago, the ones used for the down payment. She saved utility bills, joint tax records, emails between her and the loan officer. Then came the photos. The nursery before it was painted. The dresser Mira sold. Her room as it was before they gutted it. Each document had a label. Each photo was time-stamped. It wasn't revenge, it was documentation. At some point, Margaret heard footsteps in the kitchen. She froze, then relaxed when she heard the baby monitor static. Mira again, cooing at someone through a video call. Margaret returned to her screen, labeled the audio file from earlier. House history, claimed by Mira. She smiled faintly. Not bitter. Just awake now. An hour later, there was a knock at the basement door. Not upstairs. Not the front entrance. This was the door at the side of the house, near the garage, the one no one used except the trash bins. Margaret opened it cautiously. It was Bernice, her neighbor from 2 doors down, holding a foil-covered plate. "Oh," she blinked. "You're here." Margaret tilted her head. "Of course I'm here. I live here." Bernice looked uncomfortable. I thought you'd moved out months ago. That's what they said, that the house was just theirs now." Margaret took the plate with a soft, practiced smile. "They say a lot of things." And then she closed the door, softly but with finality. "They asked me to cook dinner, then ate without me upstairs." The text came in at 3:42 p.m. "Mira, could you prep the lasagna before 5? I'm too exhausted to lift a pot." No, hello, no, please. No question mark. Just a directive wrapped in exhaustion and entitlement. Margaret read it twice, standing in the chill of the basement where the only natural light came from a dirty glass block above the washer. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. She considered not replying at all. But old habits, the ones shaped by decades of keeping peace over proving points, took over. Margaret? Of course. She moved slowly, deliberately. Upstairs, the kitchen was still warm from the afternoon sun, a patch of light stretching across the floorboards like something sacred. The scent of lavender cleaning spray clung to the counters. Mira had been organizing again. More baby things lined the walls, sterilizers, monitors, a second bottle rack. The lasagna went into the oven at 4:55, just as requested. Salad prepped, bread buttered, water glasses filled and placed precisely at the edge of the table. Margaret even wiped down the stove after. She stood there for a moment after everything was done, wiping her palms on her apron. Waiting. The kitchen clock ticked. 5:30 came and went. Then footsteps. Voices. Laughter. But no one called her up. She heard the chairs slide back. The sound of silverware scraping against ceramic. Someone mentioned the lasagna. "So good," Mira said. Margaret froze at the top of the basement steps, listening through the door that separated her from the life upstairs. Not one footstep came to get her, not even a passing knock. She turned and descended slowly, each stair aching with memory and weight. Downstairs, the space was dim and spare. Just the cot, a folding chair, her husband's cedar chest now doubling as a table. She poured herself a glass of water from her basement jug and sat still. Then her fingers reached for the envelope. Inside were the photos she'd taken, of the room they'd stripped, the furniture sold without asking, her cot beside the water heater, the peeling paint behind the laundry sink, the closet with exposed wiring. She booted up her old laptop and opened the secure email account her attorney had helped her set up during the early stages of her co-ownership review. A private address, separate from the family one Alan still used. One by one, she uploaded each image, added descriptions, dates, timestamps. She attached PDFs, her financial contributions, records of property taxes split in her name. The co-occupancy clause was there too, the one Alan clearly never bothered to read when he signed it a decade ago. Finally, she typed one sentence into the body of the email. "I'm ready to document everything now." She hovered, then clicked send. The quiet that followed wasn't peaceful, it was surgical. She sat back. The smell of lasagna still lingered on her sleeves. She hadn't eaten. She didn't feel hungry. Her phone chimed 5 minutes later. From Attorney Walsh. Subject, breach, co-occupancy clause. "Margaret, based on what you've sent, we may have grounds for breach. They've violated your agreed right to cohabitation with dignity and access. Are you ready to proceed formally?" She stared at the screen. A slow inhale filled her chest. She could still feel Mira's weight crying in her arms 2 years ago after the miscarriage, her voice shaky and clinging. "You're like the mother I never had." And now? Now she didn't even get a plate of the meal she cooked. Margaret's fingers trembled, but not from weakness. She opened a new message, typed just 2 words. "Yes, proceed," and hit send. They thought they were being generous, but they'd violated the one clause that kept them here. The hallway was dark, lit only by the soft nightlight near the nursery door, the one Mira had chosen to glow faint lavender, as if pastel hues could smooth over bruises not worn on skin. Margaret stood still at the top of the stairs, the polished banister cool beneath her palm. She hadn't walked this hallway in weeks, not since her room had been cleared out without warning. Not since the cot next to the water heater became her world. Now, in the hush of late evening, while Alan and Mira slept, she walked, slowly, deliberately, like a woman reclaiming floorboards with every step. The mobile above the crib spun gently from the ceiling fan's breeze, a quiet chime drifting through the room. Tiny felt animals bobbed in a circle, foxes, lambs, stars, innocent, peaceful, detached from the world that built the space they danced in. Margaret leaned against the doorframe. Her eyes didn't linger on the nursery long. She already knew it by heart. The pale yellow walls, the curtain rods she had installed herself a decade ago when the guest room was still hers. Her hands had chosen the trim, the light fixtures. She and her husband had painted this room together the summer after Alan's wedding. He'd climbed the ladder. She'd stirred the paint. Now, she wasn't even allowed to open the door without a warning tone chiming from the baby monitor app. She inhaled sharply, then walked away. Back in the basement, she sat at her small folding table. Her laptop glowed against the gray cinder block walls. An email sat open from Attorney Walsh. Subject: confirmed breach, co-occupancy clause. Per our review, Section 4B of the co-ownership agreement states, no structural or residential space may be reassigned, repurposed, or restricted from a named co-owner without written consent. Their conversion of your private room into a nursery without notice or agreement constitutes formal breach. Are you ready to proceed with the intent to dissolve co-ownership? Her mouse hovered over the attached PDF. Margaret clicked it open. There it was, her name, the clause. The silence she'd carried in her bones suddenly had shape, legal, tangible, unshakable. She didn't shake when she signed. Not this time. The signature line glowed briefly before the screen flashed confirmation. Document signed successfully. She sat back and stared at the page. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys. A single thought passed through her. They thought pushing me down would make me disappear. She didn't disappear. She documented. The next morning, Margaret woke earlier than usual. She heard the upstairs pipes rattle, Mira's shower running. She waited until the house settled again. Then, one more time, she walked the upstairs hallway. Quiet as a breath. She paused outside her old room, the nursery. She didn't open the door, just listened to the mobile chime again. Then, soft as if speaking to no one, "I hope the child never learns what selfishness sounds like through floorboards." She left through the front door, envelope in hand. At the attorney's office, she handed over the signed form. By mid-afternoon, Alan was home. The envelope was waiting on the kitchen counter, stamped formally by the courier. Intent to terminate joint occupancy and ownership, effective immediately. Alan stood frozen in the entryway, fingers tightening around the paper. The baby registry catalog fell from under his arm and thudded to the floor. Mira came down the stairs holding a laundry basket. "What is it?" He didn't answer. Her eyes dropped to the envelope. She saw the stamp. Her face paled. Wait, what did she do? Alan looked toward the basement door, but it was shut. And Margaret? Margaret was already in the attorney's car, heading toward her bank with a folder of documents, joint mortgage receipts, deposit slips, deed scans. Every piece of the house that carried her name like a watermark they never learned to read. Back inside, Mira took the envelope from Alan's hands, ripping it open. She read it twice, then 3 times. Her lips parted. "She's evicting us." Alan said nothing, but in the pit of his stomach he knew. She wasn't leaving, she was removing them. They started locking cabinets, so I unlocked the documents they forgot I kept. The first sign wasn't shouting, it was subtraction. One morning, Margaret reached for her usual tea canister on the kitchen shelf, only to find the entire cabinet screwed shut with a cheap plastic child lock, not the ones with keys, the ones meant for toddlers. Bright white plastic, clipped tight, out of her reach unless she wanted to snap it off completely. At first she thought it was a mistake, a misstep in Mira's nesting instinct. But then came the fridge, same lock, same soft click of restriction. "Baby-proofing," Mira said offhandedly when she caught Margaret staring at it. "They say it's best to start early. You know, for muscle memory." Margaret said nothing, just nodded once, slowly. Mira didn't hand her the code. Alan barely looked up from his phone. The quiet between them now had an edge, like they were all pretending not to hear the ticking of something beneath the surface. A countdown, maybe. A fuse. So Margaret did what they hadn't expected. She adapted. That afternoon, she bought a second-hand mini fridge, hauled it down the basement steps by herself, wincing slightly as her knee gave a warning twinge. She plugged it in next to the laundry machine. It hummed like a dull memory, a soft, mechanical companion in a place where silence had teeth. She began storing her groceries there. A single shelf for her tea. A mason jar of soup. Hard-boiled eggs. Meals measured not in calories but in proof. Proof that she could take care of herself without asking them for a thing. She didn't slam doors, didn't raise her voice. She simply disappeared from their daily movements, like a name whispered off a guest list. But she moved in other ways. At the bank, she sat across from the associate with her folder open, her hands folded over it. The woman glanced down at the name on the screen. "Yes, Mrs. Ellison, your name is still active on the mortgage and the title. No, they cannot change that without your signature. Yes, you are entitled to all activity records." Margaret nodded. "I'd like full copies of everything from the past year, deposit history, tax statements, utilities if you can. Would you like it emailed?" Margaret's lips curled into the faintest smile. "Printed, please." When she returned home, neither Alan nor Mira asked where she'd gone. but Mira had moved Margaret's shoes from the front door rack to a bin by the garage. "Tripping hazard," she muttered. Margaret simply moved them back, without comment. They weren't fighting. That would have required engagement. They were retaliating through erasure. Boxes were now labeled "Our Things," even when they held linens Margaret had monogrammed decades ago. A stack of her books, old gardening manuals, classic novels, was now in a tote labeled "Library Donation." But Margaret had her own archive now, neatly filed receipts, date-stamped photos of the basement's exposed pipes and her cot under the water heater, a growing dossier quietly uploaded to her attorney, every click a counterpoint to their silence. And still, they said nothing, until someone else did. It was a Sunday. Mira's sister came to visit, full of high-pitched baby talk and scented hand lotion. Margaret stayed downstairs, folding laundry that wasn't hers. Through the vent, a rusty square above her head, she heard it, clearer than they thought she could. Mira's sister whispered sharply, "Wait, she still lives here?" Mira sighed. "Yeah. Why, can't you just, legally? Kick her out or something?" There was a pause. Then Mira's voice, lowered but cruel in its clarity. "She's technically still on the papers, but we're working on it, trust me." Margaret stood very still. Her hands rested on a damp towel. She looked up at the vent, the lattice of it, the same one her husband had installed when they refinished the HVAC. He said air should circulate between rooms like stories. Keep the truth moving. Now? The vent carried not just air, but evidence. Margaret walked to her filing cabinet and slid out one more manila folder, marked Mortgage Origination Docs. Inside, the original notarized deposit slip, $62,000, from her account, her maiden name on the check. The silence upstairs deepened. So did her resolve. Nursery with a lock, mother with none. They put a lock on the nursery door, but I built the house the nursery sits in. The alarm went off with a sharp digital shriek. Margaret froze halfway down the upstairs hallway, a bundle of clean towels in her arms. A blinking red light flared from the nursery doorframe. Then came the stomping, Mira's slippers slapping against the wood floor, Alan not far behind. "What are you doing?" Alan snapped, punching in a code she didn't know. "You can't just walk into every room." Margaret blinked, stunned. "I was putting away the laundry." "You should have asked first," Mira said, voice high and brittle. "That's the baby's space now. It's a security issue." Margaret looked at the keypad, a plastic rectangle, a code, a barrier. No one had mentioned it. No one had warned her. They'd locked her out of a room she once helped build. She went downstairs slowly, deliberately, each step echoing into the hollow quiet of the basement. Her knees ached with each descent. She didn't speak. She didn't slam the door. She simply placed the towels back in the basket and sat on the edge of the cot. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was gathering. Her hands trembled, not from age, but fury pressed into stillness. 10 years ago, that very nursery had been painted a soft green. Her husband, Paul, had insisted they choose a color that worked for every kind of future. Margaret had held the latter. He'd rolled the brush. She remembered him laughing from the top rung, splashing paint on her jeans, saying, "Whatever happens, at least we built something strong." Later that night, Margaret logged into the county records portal. She scrolled past tax summaries and plat maps until her cursor hovered over a scanned document dated 2013. Zoning use, multi-occupant parcel, shared spaces designation. She blinked twice. Read it again. That nursery, the hallway, the upstairs common bath, had all been legally filed as shared zones during the home's original dual financing application. The very structure Mira had locked her out of still bore Margaret's name in the parcel zoning file. She copied the document, saved it in a folder labeled Next Phase, then she called her attorney. "File the motion," she said. "Partition by sale. They've crossed into structural reassignment without consent." The next morning, Margaret walked the perimeter of the backyard. Early sunlight caught on the frost-laced grass. She paused by the garden shed, remembering when they'd stored baby furniture there, before the first pregnancy. Before the miscarriage, Mira had wept through in Margaret's arms. And now? Now she was a stranger with a laundry basket and no access code. That afternoon, a familiar ping landed in Margaret's inbox. She opened the email without hesitation. It was a thread, forwarded from Alan, clearly not meant for her. The subject line read, "Options if Margaret forces legal motion." One line stood out. "We may need to look at refinance options, in case this gets worse." Her hands went still on the keyboard. In case this gets worse? They still didn't understand. It wasn't getting worse. It had already begun. Margaret clicked save, printed the email, and slipped it into her lawyer's growing file. Direct evidence of intent to circumvent the deed. The keypad upstairs had been their line in the sand. Now she would draw hers, with a court seal. They wanted gifts. I made a list of what I'd already given. Margaret stood in the kitchen, back straight, eyes fixed on the flickering screen of her laptop. Upstairs, the familiar sounds of forced cheer echoed through the floorboards. The sing-song tone of Mira's voice, the chiming notification pings of a virtual baby shower, and the occasional exaggerated "aw" that followed every unwrapped gift. She had helped set up the webcam that morning. "Can you just help me center it?" Mira had asked, distracted, already arranging balloons in the background. "I don't want it to cut off the sign." Margaret adjusted the frame, angled the laptop, and stepped back without being asked to stay. "Thanks. That's perfect," Mira said. "You're good now." "You're good now." It was the kind of phrase you used when ending a service, when dismissing help. Margaret didn't argue. She walked back down to the basement and opened her own laptop, not to join the celebration, but to build a document of her own. She titled the spreadsheet, Contributions. Plain. Director. Row by row, she began filling in figures. Initial down payment, $92,000 monthly utilities. Past 10 years, approximately 23,600 grocery runs. Estimated average $400 per month for shared meals. 48,000 lawn and exterior maintenance. 3 summers of solo upkeep. 6,000 unreimbursed repairs, plumber, water heater, roof patching. $8,750. She paused after that row, hearing Mira's voice rise with gratitude on the stream above. "Oh my God, this is perfect. We've needed a diaper warmer so badly." The guest laughed. Mira beamed. And then it came. Sharp, cutting, laced with performance. "It's just been hard doing this without a real mom around, you know?" Margaret's fingers stopped mid-type. She didn't look at the screen. She didn't breathe. Her chest didn't ache. Her spine did. Real mom. A sudden breeze fluttered through the basement's tiny window slit, stirring dust from the stacked donation bins they'd filled with her belongings. Real mom. The woman who bought the house. The woman who helped name the mortgage. The one who knew every corner of the property because she painted it with her late husband's hands. She added another line. Emotional labor. Incalculable. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment and let the silence settle. She didn't cry. She counted. Her phone buzzed next to the keyboard. A single message from her longtime friend Nadine. "Come stay with me. Just for a week. Regroup." Margaret stared at the words, her finger hovering over the reply button. She thought of the cot downstairs, the keypad lock upstairs, the fridge she was locked out of, the hallway she painted, the photo she'd framed of Mira after her miscarriage, the one Mira had quietly removed from the mantel and replaced with an ultrasound photo. She looked back at her spreadsheet. A house built with love, inhabited by entitlement. She typed slowly, maybe not just for a week. She reread the message. Then she added one more row. Basement rent, market rate. $950 per month times 10 months equals $9,500. With a calm breath, she saved the file and uploaded it to the same cloud folder her lawyer now had access to. From upstairs, laughter rose again, this time thinner, tinnier. Margaret opened the baby shower livestream in a muted browser tab and watched just long enough to see Mira hold up a crocheted blanket and say, "She's going to be so loved. We're building her life from scratch." Margaret whispered to the screen. "To no one. To the air. No, you're building it from what I already gave." That night, after the party ends and the house grows still again, Margaret unplugs her mini fridge. She doesn't pack a suitcase. She pulls a larger one from the closet instead. They changed the code. I still had the title. The new keypad beeped 3 sharp tones, red light flashing, when Margaret tried to open the upstairs door. She stood there, groceries in hand, staring at the handle like it had betrayed her. It wasn't just the code that had changed, it was the silence that followed. No footsteps, no explanation, just a quiet assertion of power from upstairs. She turned, walked back down to the basement, and placed the groceries into her small fridge with deliberate calm. The tomatoes thudded softly onto the shelf. The eggs she'd picked out carefully, organic, cage-free, were set beside an unopened jar of apricot jam. She smoothed the hem of her cardigan with both hands, then walked to the far corner where an old suitcase waited. Not luggage, not escape, inventory. Margaret began packing, not like someone preparing to leave, but like someone recovering what was already hers. The motion was slow, methodical. She folded sweaters with quiet precision, placing each into the case as though she were laying bricks in a foundation. The sound of footsteps came. Alan, descending halfway down the basement stairs. "Where are you going?" he asked, half concerned, half confused. She didn't look up. "Out. Temporarily," she replied, tugging the zipper closed with one smooth pull. Then she looked him in the eye. "But not permanently." Alan frowned, shifting his weight. "You're overreacting. It's just a code. We didn't think you needed it." Margaret offered a half smile. "And I didn't think you'd need my permission to sell my dresser. But here we are." He said nothing, just stood in the half-light, lips pressed into a thin line. That evening, while the house was quiet, Mira in the nursery folding onesies, Alan pacing on a call, Margaret ascended the stairs. She moved silently, not hiding, just unwilling to explain. In the kitchen, she unfolded a single sheet of thick cream-colored paper and laid it gently on the countertop near the coffee machine. Her penmanship, neat and decisive, read, "Intent to initiate forced co-owner partition and sale under Clause B of Joint Equity Agreement unless settlement terms are renegotiated within 10 business days. Further legal steps pending non-compliance." She signed her full name beneath it, Margaret L. Dorsey. Then, beside the note, she placed a copy of the property deed, her name bold and centered at the top. The next morning, Alan found it. He didn't call her, didn't come downstairs, but he read it, twice. The faint indent of his thumbprint marked the edge where he had gripped the paper. Mira found it a few minutes later. Her response was loud enough to carry through the ceiling. "You wouldn't actually do that." Margaret didn't respond from the basement. She didn't have to. Because Mira was right. She wouldn't have. Not before the cot, not before the keypad, not before being erased one dinner at a time. But now, she already had. Later that afternoon, Margaret stepped out onto the porch with her suitcase. Nadine waited in the car, engine running, passenger seat warm. Before closing the front door behind her, Margaret paused. She reached into her purse and removed one. Last item. The garage door remote they didn't know she still had. She set it gently on the entry table beside her framed photo of her late husband, the one Mira had tried to remove. Then she walked out. Her phone buzzed as Nadine pulled onto the main road. A text from her lawyer blinked on screen. "Mediation hearing scheduled. They now want to discuss terms." The judge's gaze was neutral, almost bored, until Margaret's attorney slid the revised floor plan across the table. The paper made a soft thump as it landed, but the ripple it caused in the room was anything but small. Alan reached for it. Mira didn't. She already knew what it said. Margaret sat with her back straight, hands folded gently in her lap, not a wrinkle in her blouse, not a flicker of triumph in her expression, but her silence vibrated with control. They were seated at a long conference table inside the neutral-toned mediation center. Pale blue walls, muted lighting, a carafe of untouched water, and across from her, Alan and Mira, both tense and silent. "Let's proceed," said the judge. "Mrs. Dorsey, your counsel may begin." Margaret's attorney adjusted her glasses and tapped the highlighted document in front of her. We're not disputing the right of a family to prepare for a child, but this isn't about emotion, it's about property law. She looked directly at the mediator. According to Zoning Code 16B-114, any reclassification of a designated co-occupant space in a jointly owned single-family residence must be formally agreed upon by all title holders. No consent was requested, no notice was served. Instead, my client's room was permanently converted to a nursery, stripped, repainted, refurnished, while she was forced into the unfinished basement. Mira let out a sharp breath. It wasn't malicious, she snapped. It was a baby, not a meth lab. Margaret's attorney didn't flinch. Intent is irrelevant. The deed stipulates cohabitation rights under shared zoning. The moment the room became exclusive use for minor occupancy and Margaret's access was removed, that clause was breached. Alan tried to interrupt. We were just trying to make room. The judge raised a hand. Were you aware she was a co-title holder when you changed the room's use? Alan faltered. I mean, yes. Technically, yes. Technically? Margaret's voice cut through for the first time. Calm, precise. My name is first on the deed, Alan. The judge's pen hovered above the file. Let the record reflect that fact, she said, scribbling notes, and that the co-owner was not notified prior to reassignment of space. There was a moment of silence. It lingered. Mira shifted in her seat, crossed her arms, and mumbled something under her breath that Margaret didn't bother asking her to repeat. But what came next wasn't spite. It was structure. My client, the lawyer continued, is seeking a formal dissolution of shared residence, and per the zoning breach, she is entitled to either full forced sale of the property or a buyout at current market value plus penalties. Mira stiffened. You're kicking us out. No, Margaret said. I'm offering a way for us to live apart, with dignity. Don't frame this like you're the victim, Mira hissed. The judge leaned forward. Mrs. Dorsey is not required to justify her emotional response. Legally, her position is supported by documentation. The conversion of the upstairs space and denial of original room access meet the threshold for involuntary displacement. Alan dropped his eyes to the folder in front of him. Quietly, he asked, "What's your number?" Margaret didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at the photo taped inside her leather folio. Her husband, standing beside the freshly framed house 10 years ago. His arms were around her, his handwriting still visible on the deed's back page. Never let your silence be mistaken for absence. She closed the folio softly. I'll accept a buyout, she said finally. Her voice was gentle, but it echoed with finality. But at my price. The judge nodded. That will be noted. Mira opened her mouth, likely to argue, but Alan laid a hand on her wrist. For once, she stopped. Margaret stood, gathering her things. She didn't linger. As she reached the conference room door, she turned back, just once, and looked at the seat where she'd been told she didn't belong, and smiled. Outside in the hallway, her attorney tapped her phone, glanced over, and whispered, "They're going to ask for terms." "How high are we going?" Margaret replied without hesitation. "High enough that they remember every step I took up those basement stairs." They wanted peace, but only on sale. She offered them silence, in the currency they understood best, money, and not a dollar less than what she was owed. Margaret sat across the polished mahogany table, unmoved by the spectacle of Alan pacing. Mira hadn't said a word in nearly 10 minutes. Arms folded, eyes locked on the mediation paperwork like they might blink first. The room was sterile but thick with resentment. A wall clock ticked steadily behind Margaret's head. With every second, the air around them seemed to press tighter. "You've had the house nearly to yourselves for over a year," Margaret said quietly, her voice even, measured. "And I didn't complain. Not when you took my room. Not when you locked the fridge. Not even when you told the neighbors I'd moved out." Mira exhaled loudly through her nose. "So what? You want to make us homeless?" "I want what's mine." Margaret turned to the mediator, her tone not rising but solidifying. "At full market value." As of this quarter's appraisal, Alan groaned. "The market's high. No one's paying that." Margaret looked him in the eye. "Then you can sell it to someone who will." She didn't flinch. Neither did her attorney. The mediator cleared her throat. "Let's review the formal proposal one more time for the record." Margaret nodded, her voice crisp. "Buyout at full market rate. No deductions for wear, no back and forth over sentimental value, and—" she flipped a printed sheet forward. "Compensation for utilities and property taxes, backdated 18 months. I have records of every payment I made." Mira scoffed. "You're being vindictive." Margaret folded her hands, numbered just thorough. Then, in the softest tone of the morning, she added, "I raised someone. I'm not raising another." Alan sat down, his fingers steepled under his chin. He looked for a moment like a boy who'd broken something and couldn't admit it. I thought we could work this out privately. You didn't have to do all this." "You mean without lawyers?" Margaret asked gently. "Like how you moved me to the basement without asking?" He looked away. She leaned back in her chair. "You spent a year ignoring my presence. You don't get to negotiate my absence at a discount." Mira muttered something under her breath, but no one asked her to repeat it. Outside, the first hints of spring bloomed. Inside, a frost held. The meeting ended with Alan and Mira needing time to think it over. Margaret didn't object. She had time. What she didn't have anymore was tolerance. That evening, Margaret made herself a cup of peppermint tea. The smell of it calmed her, steam curling through the air like breath she'd been holding for months. She placed her phone on the kitchen counter and scrolled through old emails, checking the forwarded property estimate from her attorney. It had risen another $12,000 since last quarter. She smiled. Then the phone rang. Her attorney's name lit the screen. Margaret answered, steady. "They accepted," the voice said. "All terms. Full market rate, utilities included, release of title scheduled for next Friday. Funds will clear in 7 days." Margaret didn't speak right away. She simply watched the steam rise from her teacup, curling toward the kitchen light. "Thank you," she said finally. "Tell them I won't need a follow-up call." She hung up, opened her laptop, and began searching rental units, not for herself, but for something else entirely. Then she clicked to her inbox and opened a new draft. Subject line: Title transfer form. Trust update. She typed the first line. "Effective immediately. All proceeds from the buyout shall be directed to—" Her fingers paused, and then kept typing. The nursery door clicked open on hinges Margaret once helped install. She stood at the threshold for a moment, the silence pressing in from all sides. The scent of fresh paint, vanilla with a tinge of something chemical, hung faintly in the air. Pastel blues and soft grays colored the walls now. A mobile spun slowly from the ceiling fan's low hum, casting rotating shadows of stars and clouds onto the crib below. A folded baby blanket rested on the edge of a rocking chair that used to be hers. Her shoes didn't make a sound on the new rug. Margaret stepped in, slow and deliberate, as though the house itself might protest her presence. She paused beside the crib and gently touched the wooden railing, fingers brushing over a tiny chip in the paint. That imperfection, hidden beneath new color, was the only sign this space had once belonged to her. 10 years ago, she'd painted this very room in a soft sage green, with Alan holding the ladder and her husband cracking jokes from the hallway about their uneven brush strokes. Now the ladder was gone, so was the husband, and soon, so was she. She turned to the closet. Empty hangers, labeled bins, perfectly ordered onesies and a pack of unopened diapers sat on the lower shelf. Margaret didn't touch them. She didn't need to. Her presence here wasn't to reclaim anything tangible. It was to place something that couldn't be boxed up or erased. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a small cream-colored envelope. No address, no names. Just one sharp, straight crease down the middle where it had been folded by hand. She placed it on the floor beneath the window, right where the sunlight hit the carpet in a warm, golden pool. Inside the envelope was a single black and white photograph, her late husband cradling newborn Alan, his expression caught between awe and exhaustion. They were standing in this same room, though back then it had only held a twin bed, a stack of moving boxes, and one floor lamp. Behind the photo, she'd written a note in the looping script her son hadn't seen in years. May your child remember you better than you remembered me." She didn't cry. Not now. There were no tears left to pour into this house. She walked out with a soft exhale. No door slam, no lingering. The hallway lights were dimmed for the baby's sleep schedule, casting soft glows against the framed photos she no longer appeared in. She glanced at them once, then looked away. At the foot of the stairs, she paused. Her fingers grazed the banister that had carried her up and down through 10 winters, 8 birthdays, and 3 miscarriages Mira had never known about. She'd been the quiet presence in the background of their growing family, until she wasn't quiet anymore. No keys were left behind, no forwarding address, just her, leaving behind space, but not silence. That night, Alan came home late from a hardware store run. Mira was in the nursery adjusting the bassinet height. He walked into the room, barely noticing the envelope at first, but the light from the hallway landed directly on it. He crouched, picked it up, opened it. The moment his eyes met the photo, something in his face buckled. The corners of his mouth trembled, not with sadness. Something else. Regret, perhaps. Or recognition. He sat down on the carpet without saying a word. He didn't call out to Mira. He didn't hand her the note. He folded it back up and slid it into his wallet, where once a photo of his own son's ultrasound had lived. He replaced it without thinking. Downstairs, the space Margaret once slept in had already been emptied, but a faint warmth lingered in the air, like the scent of laundry soap she always used, or the quiet discipline of someone who had never needed to raise her voice to leave a lasting impression. Alan stood up, still holding the photo. He looked at the doorframe she had just passed through, and for the first time in months, whispered her name. But no one was there to hear it. "They thought they were done with me. I was just getting started." The ink had barely dried on the closing documents when Margaret slipped the folder into her satchel and stepped out of the bank. A cool breeze met her cheeks, sharp with October's edge, but she didn't pull her coat tighter. She welcomed it. Let the chill remind her. She was free now, and finally moving with her own wind again. Not out of spite, but with intention. Alan and Mira had watched her walk out of their lives thinking they'd gotten the last word. They assumed she'd end up in someone's guest room, waiting for family holidays to be included again. What they never asked, what they never even imagined, was that Margaret had already built an exit long before they pushed her toward it. The duplex stood quietly at the corner of a sleepy cul-de-sac, shaded by sycamores that hadn't yet surrendered their gold. No sign out front. No mailbox decal. Just 2 mail slots, a clean lawn, and a heavy door with a keypad lock Margaret had installed 2 years ago, before any of this had begun. Unit A, hers. Unit B, a tenant who worked nights and kept to herself. The trust on the deed read MF Holdings, a simple shield that no one ever bothered to trace. She stepped inside. The space smelled faintly of lavender from the sachets she'd tucked into the heating vents. Hardwood floors gleamed under the filtered afternoon light. Her books, her armchair, her grandmother's mirror, it was all here, waiting like a second spine she'd grown in silence. She set her satchel down and reached for the small box on the kitchen counter. Inside was the framed photo of her husband from their 50th wedding anniversary. Next to it, a handwritten note he'd left in a safe deposit box years ago. She'd memorized the words long ago, but still, she read them again. Don't put all your security in one house or one heart. Protect the pieces they don't expect you to keep. That advice had once made her feel lonely. Now it made her feel armored. She'd spent the last few weeks working with her lawyer to create an LLC from the proceeds of the buyout. Half of that money would be invested into the property. Upgrades, maintenance, stability. The other half? A small educational fund in her husband's name, specifically for children in Alan's birth town. The irony wasn't lost on her, because Margaret didn't need revenge. She needed resonance. The first donation check had already been issued. A modest start, but the email from the community school principal had nearly made her cry. "We've never had someone think of us from afar. Your husband must have had a strong legacy to inspire this." He did, and now, so did she. Margaret poured herself a cup of tea, the kettle, still warm from its earlier boil, and sat by the window facing the garden, A bird hopped across the railing, bold, black-eyed, unbothered. She watched it, quiet. Her phone buzzed beside her. At first, she ignored it. Then it buzzed again, this time just a soft preview of a message at the top of the screen. Alan, if we write a letter, would you read it? Margaret stared at it. Not for the apology that wasn't written, not for the change it implied, but for the question. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't even a plea. It was a door, not wide open but not fully closed either, the kind of door someone builds when they're starting to realize what they tore down. She didn't reply. Instead, she picked up her tea again, leaned back in her chair, and let the silence stretch. A letter might come. It might not. Either way, she wasn't the one waiting anymore. She reached over, opened the bottom drawer of her desk, and pulled out a sealed envelope addressed to herself. The return label read, Margaret Fenton, Trustee, Contingency Documents. She laid it flat on the table, unread, for now. They expected to be in the will. I rewrote the index. The desk was silent, but heavy with meaning. Margaret sat with her spine tall and her shoulders squared, the afternoon sun slanting through gauzy curtains behind her, casting soft shadows across the floor. A pen rested between her fingers, not trembling, not hesitant, but steady. The same steadiness that once held her family together. She read the document before her one last time, line by line, clause by clause. Her lawyer had already reviewed it, but this wasn't about legality anymore. It was about clarity, control, peace. Her name stood alone at the top, above a heading in crisp serif font, Last Will and Testament of Margaret Fenton. She underlined the words with her eyes, as if daring them to forget who this story belonged to. A quiet knock at the door reminded her the notary had arrived. Margaret called out gently, "One moment, please." She didn't need more time. She just needed to take this moment and own it fully. With one deep breath, she turned back to the open folder and began initialing the pages. In the section marked Property Distribution, Margaret had made a choice that no one, least of all Alan or Mira, would expect. The duplex? Not Alan's, not Mira's. Instead, it would pass to someone who had shown up without being asked. Her niece, Emily, a public school teacher, barely scraping by on a salary that wouldn't cover a quarter of what she deserved. 2 years ago, Emily had driven 4 hours through a snowstorm just to bring Margaret homemade chicken soup after she heard about her hip injury. She hadn't come for praise. She hadn't come for property. She'd come because family meant showing up, even when there was nothing to gain. The notary, a kind woman in her 40s with wire-rimmed glasses and a calm presence, settled across the table with quiet professionalism. "Are we all set, Miss Fenton?" Margaret nodded. "Almost. One final clause to review." She flipped to the section titled Educational Trust, her pen poised above the line. For the child Mira was raising, the baby she had once been pushed out of a room for, Margaret had not forgotten. But her generosity came with terms. A trust was established, accessible only upon enrollment in a higher education program, college, trade school, even a certified apprenticeship. But access would be contingent on one immovable stipulation: no cosigners, no management rights by either parent. Alan and Mira would never touch the funds. Margaret knew that might sting them. But this was not punishment. This was prevention. She wanted to build legacy, not entitlement. Before signing, she opened a fresh sheet of stationery. The ink of her final handwritten letter flowed smooth and uninterrupted. "To the child I will never fully know, but quietly believe in. May you grow into someone who chooses kindness over convenience. May you measure love not by gifts given, but by sacrifices remembered. If this trust reaches you, know it was not given lightly. It was earned by the absence of malice in your name." She folded the letter into thirds, pressed it into an envelope, and slid it into the will packet. One signature later, the documents were whole. The notary slid the packet forward, flipped the final page, and with a slow, deliberate motion, stamped the seal, heavy and final, across the signature line. Thump. The sound echoed in Margaret's chest like a closing door she no longer needed to hold open. "You're all set." the notary said softly. "Would you like a moment alone?" Margaret smiled politely. "No need. I've already had years of those." As the notary packed up her briefcase, Margaret stacked the documents neatly and slid them into her fire-safe drawer. She clicked it closed, turned the key. The finality was not cold. It was clean. She poured herself a glass of water, sat by the window, and watched the mail truck roll away. On her doorstep sat a padded envelope she hadn't expected. The return label? Allen's. No note, just a thumb drive inside. "They made me sleep beneath them. Now I rest above everything they thought I'd never rise from." The wind moved gently through the rosemary bush on the porch, shaking loose its scent in warm pulses. Margaret sat quietly in her white wicker chair, the morning sun soft against her skin, a cup of black tea cupped in both hands. The chair creaked faintly beneath her, a comfortable old sound, unlike the strained silences she used to sit in, just one floor too low to be heard. From the edge of the porch, she could see the modest street curving away like a thought she no longer needed to finish. Her duplex sat on a corner lot, just elevated enough to catch the light early, shaded enough to stay cool in the afternoons. The rosemary, potted in a wide ceramic basin by her front door, had started to sprout new shoots. She touched one gently with her fingers. Her husband had always said the smell of it calmed the mind. A small clink behind her. The mail flap snapped closed. Margaret rose slowly and moved toward the door. A single envelope lay on the welcome mat, thicker than a bill, handwritten, the letters tightly pressed into the paper like someone writing through gritted teeth. The name on the return address was unmistakable. Mira. Margaret turned the envelope over in her hands. She already knew. Not an apology. That wasn't Mira's way. She sat back down, slipped the letter into a box beside her chair. The lid bore 2 words etched in tidy black ink. Unopened. Unimportant. She didn't even hesitate. Her gaze drifted to the upstairs window of the duplex. A tenant she liked, a young woman with 2 rescue cats, was putting up shelves inside. Margaret had helped her carry them in last week, both of them laughing when a tabby leapt from a tote bag mid-step. It felt good, this quiet companionship, the kind that didn't speak over you or assign you a basement out of convenience, the kind that asked, "Is this too heavy for you?" and waited for the answer. Margaret reached down to a notebook sitting on the porch table beside her. The cover was worn leather, the pages filled with lists, thoughts, clipped newspaper articles. She flipped to the last page. One line was underlined twice. "Legacy is not a room you're allowed to stay in. It's the roof you build when they take the keys away." She traced the ink lightly with her finger. From across the yard she could hear the neighbors' wind chimes stirring. Lavender and thyme planted in the flower beds along the walkway swayed gently. The whole place smelled like memory and forward motion. Inside the house her phone pinged once. She didn't move. Another envelope had arrived the day before, one she had opened. A quarterly report from the scholarship fund. 3 new recipients. One in nursing school, one in technical design, one studying early childhood education. All of them had written thank you notes. Margaret kept those in a separate box. The one marked Keep. She sipped her tea and glanced at the horizon. No storm clouds in sight. A voice echoed in her memory, low and warm. "Don't let them write your story like you were a footnote in their future." She hadn't. Not once. She folded the empty envelope in half and slipped it beneath her teacup as a coaster. Let them write letters. Let them say what they needed to say. Let them try to drag her name into their unfinished arguments. She wasn't beneath them anymore. She wasn't even in their story anymore. They buried me beneath their future. I rose with my name still on the deed.